Both sides had comprehensive discussion. We'll take you live. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar is speaking at the International Relations Conference on India's strategic culture in western city of Pune.
I would even say at that time, many of the Maharajas of India. Because again, we have all been conditioned to think of the Maharajas as largely retrogressive people. Because it fitted the politics of the day after 1947 that they be so portrayed. But the reality, and there is a lot of literature and other evidence to back it up, that you actually had very progressive Maharajas, many of whom actually tried to create as much space for themselves and for their kingdoms and their people from British rule as possible. So it wasn't that actually the princely states were necessarily the backward parts of India. In many cases, a lot of the advancement of India, including industrialization in India, actually took place in princely states. So I point this to you, and in fact, another account which comes to my mind is Rahul Sagar's recent book, that the 19th century origins of nationalism in India. So when we think, in fact, of our own history, of what are we about, how have we got to where we are, what are the forces which drove us, I think it's important today to look at all of this, if necessary, with fresh eyes, with an open mind, revisit history, and then really see how do we use the totality of what we have before us as a way of engaging the world. Now, in a way I've spoken of history, let me move to slightly more contemporary period. Let's look even at our foreign policy record. It would be very rare to read an account of our foreign policy which is truly critical. Because if you read most accounts, it's like we've had success after success. It's not exactly true. So there are occasions, there are policies, there are choices, which today, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, we must revisit. There was recently, not recently actually, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a book by an American professor called Francine Frankel, called When Nehru Looks East. It examines a set of decisions and then comments on, on those decisions, obviously with the benefit of subsequent events in mind, but not entirely so. It gives you the forces which pushed for the choice to be made and what were the debates of that time. And they are very, some of them are really very, very interesting. Like what happens, for example, when we take our case on Jammu and Kashmir to the United Nations, and why it ended up the way it did, and who were the players who took it in that direction. So I would say today that it's important, on the one hand, to look at the choices we made. I would certainly say the choice we made in 1954 with respect to China. The choices during the 1962 war, I recently saw a comment in a newspaper about that. Could we have done differently? Could we have done better? The choice in 1972 about how we were going to proceed with Pakistan. So it's important today not to assume these were inevitable, or not to assume that they were the best choices. These are choices made. We cannot undo those choices. But there are lessons learned from the dissection of these choices. But more than choices, I would even say policies. For us, if we are to really look today at Indian foreign policy, a lot of it should also be on the roads not taken. That if one were to look today at someone like Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee, it's interesting. the critics of Indian foreign policy often were real-time critics. This is not a case of looking back after 20, 30 years and saying you got the decision right because I have the benefit of 20 years of events thereafter. At that time, when events were happening, there were people who put alternatives on the table. If you look, for example, at our Pakistan policy, at the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, and subsequently, and frankly, at our handling of Kashmir, you have actually a minister of the first cabinet who leaves the government because he has profound differences on the entirety of the Pakistan policy, and that's Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, and who actually at that time cautions Nehru about going to the UN on Kashmir. A second case is Sardar Patel himself. You know, there is this very famous exchange of views he has had with Pandit Nehru on China, that where he has given a strategic assessment of China, and Nehru, in a way, doesn't respond directly to him, but he does respond, who puts an alternative strategic assessment. So now, come 1962, many people would have said, oh, maybe Patel got it better. But Patel wrote this not in 1962, he wrote it in 1950. So it was not that the options and the thought processes were not there. Oh, today when I was looking at that film before we came in, and I thought of, in the center dedicated to Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar actually has spoken at some length and written at some length about the reasons, when he quit the cabinet as well. A lot of them had to do with domestic policy. But interestingly, one of them had to do with foreign policy, which is he differed profoundly with the way in which the government of the day was handling the United States. That he felt that we were unnecessarily getting into problems with the United States, actually by taking up the cause of China. So we were putting, this is not exactly the phrase he uses, but essentially he implies that we are putting China's interests ahead of India's interests when it comes to dealing with the United States. Or even if one looks at non-alignment, that non-alignment was meant as a statement of independence and a way of creating our space. But the fact is that at some stage, it became like being at the center for the sake of being at the center. That itself became the end objective. So when our national interests sometimes warranted leaning on one side or cutting a deal, we were hesitant to do so. So the tactics, in a sense, became strategy, and that clouded our vision. So I mention all this to you because, to my mind, if we are today to proceed with Indian strategic thought, if we are to assess international relations and view it from our own viewpoint, it is necessary, first of all, that we ourselves be less theological and less dogmatic and, frankly, less laudatory about our own record. That we need to examine our own record with a much more critical eye. And I say this because, to me, the last of these causes why we, in a sense, we are prisoners of a larger construct which we do not control today is not just hegemonism, not just modernism, not just politics of the day, not the subjectivism that I spoke about. It is actually globalism. That in a globalized world, the nature of the world today is such that the pressure for political correctness, for deciding what is right, what is wrong, for painting political forces, governments, people as outliers, while suggesting this is the norm, and this is the norm that the world has agreed upon, and if you disagree with me, you are the outlier, you cannot possibly be right, because as the custodian of globalism, there is one truth, I am the custodian of that truth, and it is a very, very clever way today of legitimizing and delegitimizing debaters. So this, I thought, were some considerations regarding our own record in foreign policy. Now, I had mentioned epics. And again, you know, many of you would be familiar. There is a deep belief in many quarters, and there's a gentleman called George Stanham who very conveniently articulated it for our benefit, that the Indians really don't have strategic thought. Now, of course, it's a slight improvement on people who said India is not a country at all. But still, the belief that, you know, somebody could have existed for 5,000 years and not have strategic thought. But here you have an eminent person from New World who now says, okay, these guys somehow survived history, but they did it without strategic thought or strategic culture. So some years ago, at actually the encouragement of one of our former foreign secretaries, a gentleman called Maharaj Kishan Raskotra, I spoke about how, to my mind, the Mahabharata was a distillation of strategic concepts, and that it is in the Indian culture often, because it's a predominantly oral culture. There is a lot out there. It may not be as explicitly brought out as, let us say, the Western culture would tend to do. But nevertheless, those deep concepts and those practices are very much there. And that eventually ended up as a chapter in the book that I brought out in 2020. Now, among the I would say the principles or thoughts of international relations which I found in the Mahabharata were obviously the dilemma of choices and the collateral damage which accompanies every choice, the constraints on competition. In the Mahabharata, these are largely emotional or social constraints or ethical constraints. Today, they can often be economic or technology constraints. The importance of strategic patience to know when to do something or not to do something. And the example I've cited is Lord Krishna's forbearance in regard to Shishupal. Or how to assess power. The choice, the dilemma, which actually the non-dilemma which Arjun faced, which was to choose Krishna or his army. And he knew which one to choose. Duryodhan didn't. Or the idea of balance of power. That when the Pandavas were taking out Jarasandh, they actually calculated what the consequences of it would be to weaken his allies, so that then the successful crowning of Yudhishthira as emperor could take place. The idea of, the whole realpolitik versus credibility, which is, are there norms? If there are norms, what are the costs of violating norms? And of course, Yudhishthira's own credibility and dilemma is the sharpest of those examples. But the fact is, if you don't have a good reputation, then it's difficult to even make exceptions. So my conclusion was that reputation actually has a value even in the world of realpolitik. Or the problems of single-minded adversaries. That if you have an adversary, a neighbor, for instance, who is single-minded about damaging you, it is a genuine problem. And Arjun's own, one of the reasons he's diverted away and Abhimanyu has to go in his place is largely because he's challenged by Shusharma and the Trigats to combat, and he cannot refuse them, and they go after him single-mindedly because they have an old grudge. Or indeed, the dilemmas of hedging, or I would say non-alignment. The fact you have a few kings who stayed out of the fight, or those who made up their minds in a very unsatisfactory way. So you had Rukma who stayed out, Balram who stayed out, or Shalya who ended up on the wrong side in a way, he was deceived into it. Or actually, if you look at it, the very thought, I would say the reality of the Pandavas who are actually disadvantaged. That if you see the Kaurav-Pandav balance, it is 11-7 in favor of the Kauravas. And yet actually the lesser force is able to defeat the larger force, and there are reasons for it. So at that time I had sought to distill from that something which is applicable in a more modern and contemporary way. That it is not just a nice tale to be read. There are actually practical lessons for analysts and practitioners of international relations to draw from that. Now, at some point, somebody kind of asked me whether the logic would hold true for the Ramayana as well. And think about it, because when we speak today of creating narratives, of having our constructs, our analogies, our hero figures, our situations, Ramayana is actually about an expeditionary force and about creating a coalition and about managing a coalition. And it is underpinned by regime change. The regime of Vali is changed to the regime of Sugriv. So how much more contemporary can it get? Or if you look at it, Lord Ram is actually the rising power. And he is trying to uphold a rules-based order. And he is doing it in a very turbulent and unpredictable world, which is full of Rakshasas who are disturbing, who are creating regional problems in a way. And he really, in pursuance of a duty to global commons, actually has to go into different situations and try to bring about global good. And if you see, as I said, the examples of diplomats, Hanuman is one, but Angad is one, even his mother Tara is one. Or if you look, you speak of a Thucydides trap. If you look in terms of parity of contestants, you have between the entrenched Rishi, Vashisht, and the rising Rishi, Vishwamitra, a very fierce competition for parity and for acknowledgement of parity. So there is, or if you look even at Ravana's own predicament, Ravana's quest is for total security. But in the quest for total security, he has secured himself against everybody except the one force he thinks is too weak to damage. And those are the humans. So the concepts are there. If we looked at it with the right view, around us, in our own culture. Today we talk about how, bad bets, let us say, which the United States made strategically in the last 30, 40 years, which have allowed counter forces to come up. Look at the boons which King Dashrath has granted.
So that was Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar speaking at the 11th International Relations Conference on India's strategic culture in the Western Indian city of Pune. The conference is still continuing. In the bulletins that follow, we'll get you the highlights of the minister's